evening, everyone. We want to thank you so much for coming tonight. Like, this is a full house. It's fantastic. Art said, I don't know that I'm that special. I'm like, oh, I think you are. Look at the crowd. So anyway, he's a pretty special guy. I'm Diane Robbins, Executive Director at the Historical Society. I want to introduce the staff of the Historical Society. We have Corey Vaughn, who's our Education Manager, Volunteer Coordinator. We have a sign-up sheet back there for anybody that ever wants to volunteer with the Historical Society. We're a small group, as you can see, so we always love to see new faces in the museum and at our events. Jared Anderson is our Collection Manager Curator. We have new exhibits at the museum that he's just kind of finished installing, so if you haven't been to the museum for a while, please come visit us Tuesday through Thursday, 10 to 4. There's some fun things to see over there. You can look at our website as well. And Devin Malson does a lot of our social media communication. How many of you saw this on Facebook? Quite a few. How many of you saw it in the Republic? Okay, good. We'll tell Brian about that too. Or even at church. I heard it was published in church. Thanks to Mary. So anyway, thank you again for being here tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the man of the hour, who just taught me how to say Luna. Luna.
What a treat to be here this evening. I tell you, I look out here, I can't believe so many people came. It's amazing. Thank you. I hope you're still smiling when we leave. I want to thank Diane and also Corey. Corey's been a real big help in putting this all together. And Jared has been very helpful as well. I tell you, this is an honor to be a speaker here for the Bartholomew County Historical Society, especially since this is an Evelyn Seward speakers series. I knew Evelyn. I taught with Evelyn a few years ago. And you know, when Evelyn retired, well, Evelyn was teaching Latin. And when Evelyn retired, that was the end of Latin. I knew the Russian teacher, John Budachev. When John retired, that was the end of Russian. I retired 21 years ago, and I was afraid that's the end of German. It's not. It's still going great. And I am so excited about that because we still have an exchange program, a student exchange program that I started, and it's still going. We had a group from Löhne who were here this spring break, and we have a group that's going over to Löhne in the next spring. So I'm so excited that the German program is still alive, and if you have kids or grandkids or great-grandkids, tell them to sign up for German. It's the place to be. Okay. Well, I hope this works. I'm not very astute at mechanical things, so bear with me. I'll try to talk fast because we have so much to go through tonight. You know, people ask me, why Löhne? Why? Well, it's a simple question with a very, very difficult answer. We're going to try to cover 200 years of history very quickly. So hang on to your seats. Here we go. All right, if I'm talking too slow or too fast, tell me. If you fall asleep, don't snore. Here we go. We're going to be talking about German migration, first of all. We're going to talk about migration in, from Germany. And it's important because it was through the migration that we have this sister city relationship. I'm going to talk about this in 5 different parts. First of all is the departure from the old world, the voyage itself, arrival in the new world, migration into Bartholomew County, and finally we get to Columbus, Löhne, Sister City Partnership. It's a long story, and it's very dramatic in some respects. All right, here we go, departure. Have any of you ever been to Bremerhaven? Oh, fantastic. Good. Bremerhaven is here. Here's Bremen, here's Bremerhaven. And you see Bremerhaven is on the North Sea. That is very, very important because almost everybody, not entirely, but most of the people who came into this area migrated out of Germany and came through Bremerhaven. All right. Well, if you go to Bremerhaven, they have the most fantastic immigration museum. That's immigration spelled with an E, not with an I-N. If you go there, be sure to go up over the dike that's protecting Bremerhaven from the sea. And when you go over the dike, at the ocean's edge, you'll see this statue. And this statue is a huge statue. And to me, it encapsulates and shows us exactly the emotions that people went through as they were getting ready to leave. It's a family group. The husband's got his arm out. He's looking excited. He's going to the new world. He's going to have new adventures and excitement. And his wife is over there looking back at the other direction. She looks sad. She knows full well she may never see her folks or her relatives or friends, neighbors again. So there was this mixture of emotions. I love that statue. All right, now let's look at types of European migration. We think mostly about the transatlantic migrations, ships that came from Europe, but there were also short distance movements as they traveled from one province to another, one town to another. And some of those were due to shifting political boundaries. I talked to one lady who said she was born in France, but then the borders changed and then she became a German citizen, but she never moved. And then after the war, the borders changed again. And voila, she's French again. And those borders often did impact a lot of people. All right. In 1763, Catherine the Great from Russia invited a group of Germans to come to Russia and settle. They needed people, they needed workers, and a group of Germans went to Russia. They're still there today. Not the same people, but their descendants are still there. They still speak German in this enclave that went there in 1763. Now, the short distance movements were most common until early in the 19th century. And then early in the 19th century, things became more long distance. And some of those early ones were forced by the state that forced people to move, or they moved because of religious persecution. For example, like the Moravians were forced out of Moravia, which today is in the Czech Republic. But where did they go when they were forced out? They went to Germany. It was just across the border. It was a short distance migration. Some moved because of political beliefs, and some moved because they intended to go back home. Those were temporary migrations. They had the anticipation of going away for a while, maybe things will calm down at home, the war will be over, and we can go back home. All right, what was happening in Europe in the 19th century? It was called the urbanization in Europe. The urban population growth in the 19th century was unreal. London increased in that century by 340%. Yeah. Paris by 345, Vienna 490, and Berlin by 872%. Now, can you imagine a town in America increasing 9 times in size in 100 years? We have immigration today, not like this. What was happening? People were moving from the country to the city. Okay. Then from 1800 to 1914, Germany had only two major cities, Hamburg and Berlin. But by the end of that period, there were 45 major cities. By 1867, 2/3 of the people lived in the countryside. Only 1/3 lived in cities. By 1912, it was just the flip-flop. 2/3 now lived in towns, and only 1/3 were living in the countryside. From the 1830s, 90% of those who immigrated came to the USA. 10% of those immigrants went to Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, and South Africa. Let's look at different phases of transatlantic immigration. Now, before 1865, they were mostly family groups and independent people. This is peasants and artisans. I can't say farmers, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. They came mostly in family groups. And if you have ancestors who came to Bartholomew County, it was probably before 1865, and they came in family groups for the most part. But from 1865 to 1895, there was more of an emphasis on individuals, both men and women. Mostly came from the rural areas. They were poor. There was poverty back home. In fact, it was so bad that sometimes the local governments were happy to see people leave and go away. They also mostly, during this period of 1865, 1895, most of those who migrated were from northern Germany. If your folks came into this area, they probably came from northern Germany. Not all. For example, my wife, part of her ancestors came from northern Germany and part from southern Germany. So, it wasn't all, but most did. And what did they speak in northern Germany? Low German. Now, Low German does not mean that it's inferior. It's a dialect. And it's a dialect that was spoken in the lowlands. The lowlands are those areas that are down low near the ocean. Now, in German, that's called Plattdeutsch. You may have heard of your ancestors speaking Platt. Platt. They also called it Plo. So, I got to tell you, a few years ago, there was a gentleman, he was a professor from Germany. He was coming through this area, and he asked me, he said, do you know anybody in the area who might still speak Plattdeutsch, Low German? I said, I do believe I know one lady. She goes to St. Peter's Lutheran Church. She's currently celebrating her 100th birthday. And her name was Mrs. Hardik. Some of you may have known her. I made contact with her and I took him over there, introduced him. And as soon as he saw her, he said to her, "Kannst du Plo?" Her eyes lit up and they started speaking Plattdeutsch. I was lost. But it was wonderful. I don't know of anybody yet who still can speak Plattdeutsch, and I don't. If you know of anybody who does, please contact me, okay? All right, let's get going here. Now, after the Civil War, the Homestead Act of 1864 opened up the West, and that was another thing that brought people here to America. Land was available, and you see, back home in Germany, you couldn't own land. It wasn't allowed. Who owned the land? The church or the aristocracy, the royalty people. And they owned the land, but they didn't farm it. They had managers for that. We'll talk about that too. All right, in the 1880s, most of the land had already been taken here in America. Most of it, not all of it. From 1895 to 1914, World War I, many individual men and women came. And they were coming from all parts of the German-speaking areas, not just Germany, but also from Switzerland, from Austria, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, all those German-speaking areas. All came with the intent of living in the U.S. It wasn't a vacation. It wasn't a temporary migration. They came to stay. They came to the cities. And in the cities, laborers and domestic service was what most of them got. There was industrialization was catching on. There were factories. They could get jobs working in the factories or for families. The rural areas, on the other hand, there were few settlement opportunities because the land had already been taken. And the poorest of the people generally stayed in the big cities because they could get work there. And here's a group that you don't hear much about, but there was a group of people who actually migrated back to Europe because of a variety of reasons. Some of them were homesick, some of them were sick, some of them couldn't cope with the culture, some couldn't learn the language, and some had people back home who were sick. They go home to take care of them. So that group we commonly overlook. Where did they come from? All these people? Ooh, look at the list. It's most of the countries of Europe today. Now, leaving was a big deal. And once they decided and made that decision to go, they had a lot to do. They had to hire wagoners, people to drive wagons, had to buy horses, buy carts, and they banded together. For safety's sake, they usually got together as a group. And where did they gather? In those gathering points? Well, notice where they gathered for camaraderie and such. They gathered in Paris, Basel, Switzerland, Cologne, Germany, Strasbourg, France, Frankfurt, Leipzig, Mannheim, Mainz, and Berlin. Now that's not where they got on the ship, because none of those places are on the sea. This is where they would gather to get together and form a group. The rivers were the main avenue to get to the ocean, to get to the ports of departure. Basically from the Rhine, the Seine, and the Weser. Now you'll hear me mention later on that Löhne is located on the Werra. That's W-E-R-R-E. The Werra was important for those who left Löhne and they got on those boats and went on the Werra, which flows into the Weser. And the Weser then flows into Bremen. All right. Notice the cities of departure. Major cities of departure. On the Atlantic, we have Le Havre, France, Antwerp, Belgium, Rotterdam, the Netherlands. And then on the North Sea, we have Hamburg, Bremen, and Bremerhaven. And in Great Britain, we have London and Liverpool. Some of them even crossed over to England to sail out of Great Britain. I don't know why a lot of them did that. They said it was cheaper, but maybe the trip was supposed to be shorter, but I don't grasp that. All right. Then after 1880, there were southern ports in Genoa and Naples, Italy. All right, until the middle of the 1850s, the majority of German immigrants left from non-German ports, especially from Le Havre. And after 1855, Bremen, Bremerhaven, and Hamburg became the most important. After 1890, most immigrants came from Eastern and Southeastern Europe. All right, but along this 100 years' time, things did gradually get better. There were certain things that made it easier for them. One was the reduction of customs as they traveled from across one country, one state. Germany at one time had over 400 different little duchies and states. And as they traveled from one to another, every little duke or prince had to have his share, and they had to have a toll. But as those got bigger, they were crossing fewer lines, so the tolls went down. A big thing happened in the late 1820s, and that was the introduction of steam navigation. However, steam navigation, although it started in the late 1820s, did not really come into play until about 1850, 1860. So Up until then, up until the 1850s, 1860s, everybody was coming by sailing ship. All right, in 1827, the harbor of Bremerhaven was developed, open to barges. Bremen is about 50 miles inland from the coast. So, but they couldn't get the big ships up to Bremen. But there was Bremerhaven, and by, 1827, the harbor of Bremerhaven was developed. Then the big ships was where they went to get them to come to America. And that, when they went to Bremerhaven, this opened up barges could get there. And the trip from Bremen to Bremerhaven was a distance of only about 35 miles. About like from here to Shelbyville. And it did take 2 to 3 days. Remember that. We'll come back to it in a minute. In the 1830s, the railroad was being developed all over Europe. And every time a new railroad was developed, that was a plus. That facilitated their ability to get to the ocean. Also, there was competition among immigration agencies. We might call them travel agents. There were men out there. In fact, in the middle, the poster in the middle over there, the little one, that's an advertising poster advertising, come on board, will come with us and sail with us to somewhere. And but in 1832, there was a major thing happened, and it was the immigration ordinance was put in place, which guaranteed that from then on, you were supposed to have, I say supposed to have, 14 square feet per person. Now that's about 1 meter square. Supposed to. It wasn't like that, especially in 1832. People were still very crowded. We'll see that in a minute. Also, the boats, the ships were supposed to provide 90 days of food aboard each ship. Supposed to. It didn't happen in 1832. That didn't happen until after the 1850s. So, how did people have food? You go on the plane today, they feed you. You go on a cruise, they feed you. You go on a sailing ship to America, they don't feed you. They had to bring their own food with them. Well, imagine. How long did it take to get from Germany to America? Anybody know?
20 days.
No. Try 60 to 70 days. 2 to 2.5 months they were on the ship. Well, could you imagine going to Kroger and getting enough food for 2.5 months? But don't forget, you're not going to be able to cook any meat. You have no refrigeration, no facility to bake anything. What about bread? How do you prepare for 2.5 months? It was hard, okay? And in 1862 now, the railway from Bremen to Bremerhaven, remember how long it took before? Now it goes down to 1.5 to 2 hours. That was big. That really improved the trip. All right, now let's look at the voyage itself. The voyage itself was very, very challenging. I said they were supposed to be guaranteed 14 square feet per person. Do you see where that is? No. Maybe the boy with his foot hanging over the edge there might, but no, they were crowded together. And prior to 1860, all the voyages were aboard sailing ships. They were not steam. And the average crossing time from Bremen to US took 60 to 70 days. There were 3 classes: first class, second class, third class, which was also called steerage. There was also a 4th class that they didn't like to advertise. That was below steerage. Most people came by steerage, or 3rd class. There was a communal space, a large dormitory. That was also their dining room. That was also their common room. There was no privacy, no tables, no chairs. Luggage was stored between the bunks. There was a minimal light below deck. poor ventilation. Bunks were stacked too high with 5 people per bunk. Yeah, it was crowded. And these ships came with a full load. There were also problems with bad weather, which caused people to get seasickness. Some had homesickness, and some just got sick from a variety of diseases along the way. Now, what about the food during the voyage? Well, prior to the 1850s, passengers brought their own food with them. They had too little food. They didn't know how to calculate how much food to take with them. So often, what they had was either unsuitable or was perishable foods. Later, in accord with the Immigration Act, ships were required to carry food for 90 days worth of food. Now this food, however, since it didn't take them later on, it didn't take them 90 days to get here, by the time they got here, they had leftover food. So what did they do? These ships were fitted as freight ships, and they were bringing people here, and then they'd load up with goods and take the goods back to Europe. And they took that leftover food back with them. Then the next group of people that came on that ship, when they started off, what were they eating? Leftovers for a long time. Yeah. Until they ran out of that. Then after they ran out of the leftovers, then they got to start on the new food. I call it new food. The food during the voyage, however, was often spoiled or rotten. It was usually of poor quality, small portions, poorly prepared. Food was usually prepared with stale water, with a smell and bad taste. Food quality did improve at the end of the trip after the old food was eaten. Then they got to eat the good food. And towards the last week or so of the trip, then sometimes they got to eat good pork. Drinking water, they had some. It was good. It was clean. They only got 1/4 quart per person per day. 1 cup of water per day. Okay. Treatment of passengers sometimes was not very good because the crews of these ships, these were people who were accustomed to taking goods back and forth. Now, all the time, these people getting in the way, so they weren't treated very kindly. And they were especially bad on the ships that were freight ships. And discipline was of a quasi-military style sometimes. And yes, there were people, German immigrants, who got out of hand and did things they shouldn't. They had to be disciplined. And then there were those who died at sea and they had to be buried. And I think one of the pictures in the little handout that you have shows them burying somebody at sea. All right, they did have worship services aboard the ships. The religious services were provided for Catholics 2 times per month during the voyage, and for Protestants, daily prayer services were provided. Also, mission opportunities were provided on both sides of the Atlantic. Prior to the 1860s, pastoral care in Bremerhaven, and then after the 1860s, it moved back to Bremen rather than out of Bremerhaven. In the 1860s, major churches expanded their immigrant work to help them provide them for their spiritual needs and other things on the European side. They also started up mission-served branches here in Baltimore and in New York to provide the incoming immigrants with spiritual guidance, advice, and information on travel, where to go, how to get there, and also warnings against swindlers. Yeah, people took advantage of them because these people didn't know the language. I mean, can you imagine coming into a country, you don't know the language, you don't know anybody, you don't know where to go to get a room to stay, you can't read a menu. It was a challenge. So these mission services were provided for them. In 1873, the Lutheran Immigrant Mission was set up in collaboration with the Association of home missions, and the Catholic associations to provide spiritual care and practical support. I understand that that service is still being provided today in Baltimore, and I have a former student who, after graduation from college, went to work there. So it's still being used to help people coming into the country. All right, 1860s to 1875, a major shift. Steamships were replaced by steamships were replacing sailing ships. And look at the crossing time now. It decreased to 14 days. It had been 60 to 70 days, down to 14 days now. Big difference, big difference. What was the result of that? Well, now the food was better. Because they only had to have 2 weeks of it. But remember, the rule was that the ship was to take 90 days worth of food. Because they had to have some left over, to take back for the next crew. But they did provide morning coffee and bread, lunch, soup, meat, pieces of potatoes, and for supper they had cabbage with meat and potatoes. And the conditions were still crowded, but there was better ventilation, better lighting. They were able to slaughter and bake on board. Yeah. And children could have fresh milk. There were kosher meals for Jewish passengers. Now here was a major thing that helps comfort-wise. The hand luggage was still kept between the beds, but the rest, those big trunks that they brought with them, were now stored in a special baggage room, so it wasn't right between the beds. They also now had tables and chairs for eating, and the ship company was providing blankets, one per person, and a tin cup per person, and spoons. So those sound like minor things, but those are improvements over what they had. All right, we mentioned another level on the ship. First class, second class, third class, or steerage, and then there was a fourth level. And that was relegated to the Eastern European immigrants who were coming. They couldn't speak German for the most part, so they were separated from the rest of the people. On that lower deck, below steerage, the air was thicker, it was hotter, portholes were lower, they couldn't be opened for a good part of the trip. All right, now, they're settling in the new world. You remember the TV show, Wagon Train? Do you? It was kind of a romanticized thing, but honestly, a lot of it was true. These people came, they didn't know where to go, how to get there. They didn't have any Google Maps or anything to guide them along. But they had to have somebody who did know how to go. And so the wagon master was very, very important. And we see this picture here of the Conestoga wagons moving together for safety's sake. And the wagon master then was really important because he's supposed to know where they're going. He's supposed to know where they get water and where and how to be safe. Now some of the people dropped off as they moved along because some of them found a place they'd like to stop and stay. Some of them had relatives or people they knew and they'd stop and go off with them. So as they moved along, the length of the wagon train sometimes got shorter. What was the first thing? One of the first things they did when they stopped was to build a house out of a log cabin. Okay. The ports of entry in the 19th century into America, there were three major ports: Baltimore, New Orleans, and New York. Baltimore was the most important in the first half of the 19th century, while New York was most important in the second half of the 19th century. New Orleans was very important, especially for those who were Catholic, as they left from Le Havre and came to New Orleans. New Orleans had been settled by the French, so they were welcome there. Also, if they came in through New Orleans, it was the easiest way to get inland into the Middle West, because all they had to do was go up the Mississippi Some of them got off at St. Louis, some of them went over on the Ohio and went to Evansville or to Louisville, and then they would spread out into northern Kentucky, southern Illinois, southern Indiana, and we'll talk in a minute about a group that came here via this route. Now, immigration ports were mere transit points, and 2/3 of the people who came in through these ports did not stay there. They were just transit points, and then they moved on to wherever they were going. In 1847, special aid organizations were put in place. German-speaking businessmen on both sides of the Atlantic decided they could work cooperatively with the ship people, and together they could make more money. So they established these German societies to facilitate the travel of all the travelers, and they encouraged immigration into America, and they facilitated the move once they got here, and they helped them look for jobs. They were how to find housing, and they supported those who fell in hard times. And they were against professional beggars, the work shy. That's my political correct term for the lazy. The ill and criminals. They didn't want to deal with them. Now, most important were the relatives and countrymen who were already here. And this developed then into chain migration. Those who were here would write home and say, "Hey, Johann, it's great over here. You can buy land, you can have freedom of religion, you can have all sorts of liberties that you didn't have back home. Come on over." And they did. And as they brought their relatives over and their neighbors, that was called chain migration. All right. There were 4 major inland travel routes by 1850. We mentioned the one of New Orleans, where they could go up the Mississippi and the Ohio, but some people who came in through that port didn't. And when they got to New Orleans, they went west, and they went west to Texas. And there's a large group of people in Texas today who have their roots from German immigrants. All right. Another route was, if they came into New York, was to go up the Hudson River and get on the Erie Canal that had been completed in 1825, go over to Buffalo, and then sail on the Great Lakes. And once they were in the Great Lakes, they could come down to Cleveland, to Detroit, go around Michigan, come down to Milwaukee, and then Chicago, and of course all this while, once they got to those ports, then they could spread out all over Michigan, Wisconsin, northern Illinois, northern Indiana, northern Ohio, and even into Ontario. If they came in through Baltimore, there were 2 choices for them. There was the northern route and the southern route. They would normally come to Pittsburgh by train, by a wagon, I mean, until they got to Pittsburgh, and then they had a choice. If they took the northern route, they would keep on coming across country on what was called National Road. And they'd come by the National Road to Columbus, Ohio, to Indianapolis, to St. Louis, and there was the gateway to the west. But if they came by the south route at Pittsburgh, they got on the Ohio, came down until they got to Cincinnati, and most of them stopped at Cincinnati then and got work. There was work because at that time, in the early part of the 1800s, they were digging the canal, the Miami-Erie Canal, to connect the Ohio River with Lake Erie. And it was a big, big job. They got work. They got money. And some of them got married. So it was important to stop in Cincinnati. Those who came into Bartholomew County, for the most part, not all, but most, came to Cincinnati and then came into southern Indiana. The first immigrant station was called Castle Garden, and it was established in 1855 in New York, and it was a registration station, and they have overnight stays. This was the first time then, after 1855, that they actually had, that they were regulated. You had to register when you came in. Before that, it was just free. You didn't have any customs to go through. It was amazing. But now people almost always, wherever I give a speech, or wherever people tell me, my people came through Ellis Island. And I have to ask, really? When did they come? Did they come in the 19th century? Oh, yeah. Well, they couldn't come through Ellis Island because Ellis Island did not exist until 1892. Ellis Island, I don't mean to minimize the importance of the role of Ellis Island, but it wasn't until 1892 and after that people did have to come through the process there. This was the end of free and unhindered immigration. The admission was more restricted to control the numbers. And if you look on that one chart, let's see, what page is that? The chart, page 11 of the handout. It shows you graphically there how many of the immigrants who were coming were German, how many were Italian, how many Irish, and so forth. And you see, most of them were from Germany. Medical exams were now required and enforced. And if you didn't pass the medical exam, you were sent back. It was as simple as that. Okay, so they were required also to have a certain amount of money. They didn't want the people who couldn't afford it to be here. I've never been able to find how much that was. So if you ever find out how much it was, let me know. I don't know. Now, only the steerage passengers were subjected to such stringent conditions. Those in first and second class were not. Between 1892 and 1924, if you look on that chart, 16 million people, 16 million came in through New York at Ellis Island. But they didn't all stay, because 2 to 3% were sent home. Why were they sent home? If they were sick, they were sent home. If they didn't have enough money, they were sent home. If they were undesirable, a thief, they were sent home. And so Ellis Island came to be known as the Island of Tears. Another thing about this, by this time, the ship owners were processing people in Europe to make sure they were well before they got on the ship. Because who paid for these people to go back if they didn't get in? The ship company had to pay for their passage back home. And they didn't want to do that. So the ship companies were being more stringent on that. All right, now we're going into the immigration into Bartholomew County. Do you want to stand up for a moment, stretch a little bit? Yeah? I see some heads nodding, some say no. Let's stand up for about 2 minutes, okay? Seymour. Do you remember, you probably saw the movie Gone with the Wind. Do you remember when you got to the intermission, you thought you were at the end of the movie? Well, we're going to the second half of the movie today. All right, let's look at German immigration now into Bartholomew County. And we look at St. John's, White Creek in 1840. All right, that was the first German Lutheran church here in Bartholomew County. And we're going to look at a lot about this particular church. It was the mother church of St. Paul Clifton in 1848, and it was also the mother church of St. Peter at Waymansville in 1871 and St. Paul's at Jonesville in 1877. You say, well, what about St. Peter's? That's a big church. Well, St. Peter's is here in town. The people who came were not town people, and they settled out in the country, and that's where their churches were, where they lived. And it wasn't until later that St. Peter's was established, and we'll see that in a minute. Well, who were these people who came? They were farmers or peasants. I can't really use the term farmers because farmers implies they had land. Back in Germany, they didn't have land. They couldn't. They weren't allowed to own land because the aristocracy or the government or the church owned almost all of the land. There were three different levels of farmers or peasants. There were the Tagelöhne, who were the itinerant workers picking up odd jobs here and there. There was the Heuerling or Heuermann. He was a tenant farmer. And he was given by the supervisor, he was given a small house for him and his family with a little plot for their garden. But he didn't own it. And the Cologne, or colonus, was the head farmer or supervisor, overseer. That is not a military term. It's a Latin term and means overseer. He, on the other hand, had a big house, a nice house. And he had something that none of the other people had. He had the right to pass on his position as the head, the supervisor of the farm. He could pass that on to his son. And usually it was the oldest son in most towns. In some towns it was the youngest son. That wasn't a very good method because most of the guys did not want to stay home and work for their youngest brother. But what happened if the Cologne had no sons but had two daughters? Had daughters. The right was passed on to the oldest daughter on the provision that her husband would take her name so that the name of that farm stayed with the farm. And so if you're doing some genealogical work and you find a man's name you're looking at, suddenly it looks like his name changed. Well, probably because he married an oldest daughter who got the farm. This being the case on how this system of inheritance works, most of the people who came, most of the men, were not the oldest son, because the oldest son knew when dad goes, he gets the position. So he stayed home in Germany. So all those who came, for the most part, were son number 2, number 3, number 4, and so forth. So, yeah. Okay, where did they come from? Well, in Bartholomew County, let's look at this. In 1830, the first group of Germans came to Bartholomew County into northeastern Bartholomew County. And those were the Moravians. The Moravians had been driven out of Moravia, which is today the Czech Republic. They went into Herrenhut, Germany, which wasn't very far away, and then eventually they came to Pennsylvania, to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and then they went to Salem, North Carolina, and then in 1830 a group led by Martin Hauser I think he went to Hauser High School. And, they came here and they established, he bought up a large chunk of land out around Hope. And they were going to establish a new town. And they had a church, they had a school, they had a girls' school, they had a seminary. But you know what? They were going to call it Goshen. But the post office said, you can't do that. We already have a Goshen, Indiana. It's up in northern Indiana, so you're going to have another name. Well, Martin Hauser said, well, we came here to the land of honey, and milk and honey, and like Goshen, but we came here with a lot of hope. So let's just call it Hope. And that's a true story, and that's why Hope is called Hope. Now, in the 1820s, there was a group that came from Grrmany to Baltimore, to Cincinnati, and to Indiana. And a lot of them were North German, and there were, in Cincinnati, there were 2 Lutheran churches. There was one for North German-speaking people and the other German church. And if you wanted to go to the North German church, you had to sign the Constitution that you would speak Low German. Okay? So, now in 1834, a group came from Osnabrück, which is, Osnabrück is over here. Let's see, there's Bremen. There, okay. Right in here is Osnabrück. That was a different area, different group from what came here. And they came to Cincinnati, and most of that group then settled in Jackson County, especially out around Sowers. All right. In 1839, a group came from Cincinnati, and they spread out here, and they came to White Creek. How many of you know where White Creek is? How many of you don't know where White Creek is? Have you looked for it on the map? It's not there. And the thing that's unique about White Creek is there has never, ever been a town there. Not as much as a town tavern, like Jonesville has. Look what's there. There's the church and the school. And from the very beginning, those 2 things were that was the cohesive thing that bound all those people together, was their church life and the school. All right. Then, in 1848, there was a group of 100 people. 100 people left Löhne together and came to America. They didn't all come to southern Bartholomew County, but they did come to America together. And we know for a fact that they were here because, look at the back side of paper, the handout you have. In 1852, I believe it is. I don't have it. Can I take a peek at somebody's? Yeah, 1852. In 1852, 43 of the 77 signers of the Constitution at St. Paul, Clifty, were from Löhne. That is amazing. Yeah. And you have in your packet there a copy of those signatures, both in the original handwriting, and then I've typed them into English spelling or English letters. And some of them are illegible, but anyway, they're all there. So we know that 47 of those signers came from Löhne. When did they come? Well, in 1830, the Moravians came to Bartholomew County. 1835 to 1845 were all these Lutherans. 1849 to 1855 was another wave of Lutherans. In 1870 and thereafter, there was another group of Lutherans. And in 1849, there was a small group of refugees and war brides. But they never were to organize like the Lutherans were. Why did they come here? Why? Number one reason for economic factors. There was poverty back home. They were poor people, very poor. And they had opportunity here to buy land, to choose their church, to choose their politics, and so forth. The inheritance rules played a role in this also, which went over that. The Industrial Revolution had already started in England, and the loom, the automated loom, had been invented, and they were producing fabric in England much cheaper than they could in northern Germany. In northern Germany, almost every home had a room with a loom in it, and every winter the family would sit there and they'd take turns weaving fabric, but they couldn't compete with the automatic loom. So that was another factor. Bad weather. You've probably heard of the potato famine in Ireland. Well, it wasn't just in Ireland, it was pervasive throughout most of Europe. So they had 2 years for very bad crops. Some came because of military appointments. They were draft dodgers. They didn't want to fight, and there were a lot of battles going on as all those princes and dukes and such were fighting one another for power. And here they had opportunities to buy land and to have independence. And then there was the gold rush in 1849 that drew some of them over, and they kept going to California. And then some did come for religious freedom. But it wasn't because they were persecuted back home, but it was mostly because they had no choice. Whoever was in charge of where they lived, the prince or duke or whatever his title was, would tell you, okay, we're Catholic. We're all Catholic. Or, no, we're Lutheran. We're all Lutheran. So you had no choice. And so here you had choice. Let's go back to White Creek. And the name Johann Heinrich Erveste at White Creek. 1250. That's a long time ago. I can't even remember that very well. That's what my kids said. But his family settled in the little town of Riesta, which is above Osnabrück, in 1250. The house is still there. I've been there. They told me that they remodeled the house back in 1890. It's true. All right. Johann Heinrich Erveste left in 1834, heading here. And in 34, we know that he arrived in Baltimore and came to Cincinnati. And we know that he mentioned in a letter in 1837 that he met a Dietrich Pardig in Cincinnati. How do we know this? Well, it goes back to his homestead. Through research, we've discovered there was a box discovered in the attic of his house back in Germany. And all these letters that he had written detailing his journey as an immigrant and his settlement here in America. And that's how we know all this is true, because it comes from those letters. I did not know that they'd been translated into English, and some of you showed me on the way in here. I am so excited, I gotta have a copy of those. Okay. Now, also, he mentioned in 1839, a Mr., besides himself, Herr Sanders and Herr Pardig, that they all three came to Bartholomew County and bought land. Now, this is big. This is like the beginning of the German immigrants in southern Bartholomew County. Notice also, a month later, he went back to Cincinnati. He wasn't living here. He bought the land here, but hey, there was nothing out here. He had to go back to Cincinnati and and get a bride and entice her to come out here with him into the wilderness. And so in 1840, they moved to Bartholomew County. And in 42, by the way, the church was established in 40, but the building was not built for 2 more years, and it's a log cabin. So what about? Well, they were having church in someone's home for a couple years. And then in 1840, they came to Bartholomew County. 1842, this is big. In 1842, Johann Heinrich zur Erste, Herr Allebrand, Herr Krabel, Herr Schumacher, Herr Padi, Herr von Holt, and Herr Postel all came together to Columbus, 1.5 blocks away from here, to the county courthouse, and applied for citizenship. This is big. They came to America and they wanted to be citizens. And the 6 of them came together. And in 42, the building that you saw the picture, it was a log cabin, was built. And then in 62, the building that's down there today was built. And remember what was going on in our history in 62? The Civil War. So that was a big thing. That's a nice church, and they built a nice church during the time of the Civil War. All right, historical German church founding dates. Look at this: 1830, the Moravians; 1840, St. John's of White Creek; 1846, White Creek Methodists. There was a circuit rider coming around, and he was taking some of those good Lutherans and making Methodists out of them. All right. In 1848, St. Paul's Clifty was founded. In 1852, St. Paul's of Borchers, which is just across the county line. I can't really count it because it's on the other side of the county line, but it's real close if you're down by White Creek. And that was in 52. In 58, St. Peter's in Columbus. Why was it so late getting St. Peter's here in Columbus? For a couple reasons. Like I said before, these were farm people. They lived out on the farm. But Columbus was a small town at this time. It was just growing. And finally, they were starting to get some industry here and more people that were living in town. But there was also that thing called Clifty Creek. And people got tired of going across Clifty Creek to ford that creek to get to church out there in the country. So, in fact, a couple people did drown. And so they did establish the St. Peter's here in town. And so St. Peter's in town is a sister congregation from Clifty. All right. And then there was 1871, St. Peter at Waymansville, and 77, St. Paul's at Jonesville. All right, now we come to Columbus Löhne Sister City Partnership. We look at 1983 to 2023. You've probably driven by this and didn't know it. This is in the cemetery at Clifty, out on Highway 7, 3 miles southeast of town here, in the old part of the cemetery next to the church. And this stone says A-N-E, Shite. How many shites do we have here tonight? 1, 2, 3, all right, 4. This is the stone of Anna Maria Engel Scheidt. What happened was, I've got to get my cheat sheet out here. You have this in front of you. It's the back page. 1988, we received a letter from at St. Paul. Pastor Stocky received this letter. Do you remember reading that to us? Do you think so? And this man, Hans-Günther Lichte, from Germany, was looking for the grave of his wife's great-great-grandmother, Anna Maria Engel Scheidt. He had put an ad in a genealogical magazine in San Francisco, and the lady, I believe it was in, I think it was Iowa, may have been Nebraska, may have been Missouri, saw it. And she sent a letter. She said to Pastor Stocky, or to Hans-Günther, maybe one of you send a letter to the church at St. Paul in Columbus, because there were people there. She had been a Scheidt. And she said, there are people back in Columbus with the name of Scheidt. And Pastor Stocky read us that letter one morning. I was there, my wife was there, she also spoke German, and Janice Finke Scheidt was also there. She had married Tim Scheidt. The three of us were especially excited because he was looking for this tombstone that was right there in our cemetery. It was amazing. So what happened? The next year, Hans-Günther Lichte and his wife came to Columbus so that they could see his wife's great-great-grandmother's grave. That was big. The next year, my wife and I organized a group, and we took 30 people the next year to Löhne. Now notice, this is big. Look at 1990, that list. 1990, I don't have it on the screen here. 1990, the first group from Columbus went to Löhne, and we took 30 people with us. But notice what happened. 23 of those 30 people made some sort of a family connection. Is there a connection between Columbus and Löhne? I think so. Now in 93, the first student group from Löhne came to Columbus. 93, Löhne, this is in December now, Löhne City Council ratified the partnership with Columbus. In February of 94, the Columbus City Council ratified a partnership with Löhne. And in 94, the first student group, which I led, went from Columbus to Löhne. And since then, we have had this student exchange between Columbus and Löhne. It's not been every year, it's every 2 or 3 years, but it's still ongoing. And let me see. Then Hans-Günther Lichte came here in 1998 for a big celebration. St. Paul. What happened in 98? You remember what was that? No, he came by himself. What was the event? What was happening in 98 at St. Paul? Don't remember? Pastor Bowman, what was happening? 150th anniversary. The church was already 150 years old. And Hans-Günther came for that event. Unfortunately, it was ironic what happened. He came here looking for his wife's great-great-grandmother who had come to America, got sick, and died here, never made it back to Löhne. He came here to celebrate with us our 150th anniversary, and he died here, never made it back. However, he was cremated and his ashes were taken back, and he is buried in Löhne today. So I thought that was ironic about how that all worked out. All right, the first exchange of 2 individual students in 2001 was from Columbus to Löhne, and we have the parents of one of those students here on the front row tonight, Julie Holtz, and her parents are here. It's great. And in 2004, Donna Sass published a book on the history of our partnership. In 2009, St. Paul, as you know, when you go out 7, you'll see that they have the new church now down over the hill, and stained glass windows were installed, and one of those was dedicated as the history window. And in the history window, it's beautiful. You have a farm family in the foreground, and in the background, you have the old church up on the hill, and you see a church, or see a ship coming in, and you look up on the flag, on the pole of the ship, and it says, Löhne. It's amazing. Beautiful. So if you go out to St. Paul Ecliptic, make sure you see the history window. When you go in the sanctuary, it's off to the right. Okay. All right. In 2014, we had a near calamity. A near calamity because Indiana First Lady Karen Pence was going, as I read in the newspaper, she was going to Löhne to take a project from Parkside Elementary students. I read it and I said, oh no, she can't be going to Löhne. That's not our sister city. And I tried and tried, I don't know if I think I got through to her people to get her corrected. She did end up going to Löhne, and I have seen the project. It's hanging in the city council chamber today. So, but see, people don't realize, if you don't know the German language, that there's a difference between O and Ö. Ö is a different letter. It's got 2 dots over it. You pronounce it differently, and it makes all the difference. There is the town of Löhne, about 40 miles away from Grrmany. And it is confusing, but Löhne is only about half the size, has about 23,000 people, where Löhne has about 45,000 people. So make sure you know the difference, and when you go to Löhne. All right, in 2015, a senior at East High School by the name of Tyler Johnson came to me. He wanted to do something about the German relationship. And so he was able to raise enough money through donations for 3 years membership in the Sister City International program. And you know, I've been very delicate here in trying to shy away from using the term Sister City and call it our partnership, because this is a trademark name and we really should be paying our membership if we use the term Sister City. So he was able to raise enough money for 3 years, but he's been gone for more than a couple of years now, so maybe we need to look into that and re-up our membership in Sister City International. Look at those statistics at the bottom. In the last few years, since '98, from Löhne to Columbus, there have been 34 groups or individuals who have come here. That's a lot. And from Columbus going to Löhne, there's been at least 31 groups or individuals. I was just over there at the beginning of April, and there was a group of students here at the same time. There's a group going over to Löhne in next year, in 24. That's why I put the date 24, because I know they're going. There may be some other people who've gone and I didn't know about it, but I find this astonishing. How many people from our town have gone and how many have come over here? Some of you I know have gone, some of you have hosted these people who've come, and that's wonderful. I thank you so much. It really means a lot. And I hope and pray that we can continue to have this relationship, this partnership. Okay? Now, I'm a Jeopardy freak. I mean, really a freak. I have a t-shirt that says, "Do not call me at 7:30. If you call me at 7:30 to 8, you better leave a voicemail. I'm not answering the phone." But you know, Jeopardy, they have the final question. It has to be, your answer has to be in the form of a question. Now, I'm going to pose a question to you. The question is, why Löhne?